Russia would probably stay on the sidelines if America was to act in this regard, to act militarily.
Hi, welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. I'm James Heappey, and today I am joined by Mark Urban, Sunday Times journalist and host of the Crisis Room podcast. We're recording this on Thursday lunchtime, UK time. And as ever, in the fast-changing world that we now seek to commentate on, it's necessary to say that because who knows how the world might change by the time that you're viewing it. But Mark, welcome. Lots to discuss. And I wonder if we can start with the UK Defence Review and put that in the context of what we've seen with this amazingly ingenious drone strike onto Russian strategic bombers, and this very visible depiction of the asymmetry of the emerging battle space, where very cheap, disposable, high-tech solutions can be found to defeat, billion-dollar, industrial age technologies that have previously been the bedrock of a nuclear deterrent even. So this feels like a real moment, and the UK SDR is published in that moment. And I just wondered if what your reflections are on the UK SDR and the degree to which it answers the challenges of the battle space that's emerging in front of us.
Well, yes, it's a big topic. Anyway, thank you for asking me on, and we do have a certain amount of time, so at least we're not trying to do this in 2 minutes. So let's look at this. I mean, look, it's a hugely ambitious document, this defence review, and of course, as you well know, it tries to do lots of different things, which could broadly come under the heading of, the UK has to get real about the possibility of a conflict against another state, something we really hadn't thought about seriously throughout the post-Cold War period. And we ended up in these so-called contingency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, in other words, long-running wars of choice, in which, we'd run through the munitions and everything at a certain steady rate. And really, we ended up evolving capabilities for finding and eliminating people who were, say, in the back of a pickup truck or walking along an irrigation canal in Afghanistan, and missiles with nuclear warheads on them sailing out of Scotland on continuous patrol, and very little credible in between those two things. So they're trying to mend that problem or backfill or deal with the so-called hollowing out of the armed forces in that respect. And the thing that you mention, I guess, is both a terrible challenge in the sense that, to produce drones and other weapons as quickly as needs to be done and to keep them relevant and technologically up to scratch is something we've seen from Ukraine, requires changes almost monthly, whereas the MOD has a sclerotic procurement system, which only too well, and that people used to say before this paper was published. I spoke to one officer who was involved in this special group that buys weapons for the Ukrainians. And he was telling me on the drone front, things evolve pretty much every 6 to 8 weeks, whereas it takes the MOD 6 years just to write the specification for a new weapon. Now, in this paper, they have tried to tackle that specific point, which comes right back to your question, and to try and speed up the whole process at which the UK can acquire new technology to sort of a year or two rather than several years, to sort of get the whole project moving and try and do things right. And listen, we can only hope that they're successful in that regard, because it's not just a matter of acquiring the right sort of weaponry for the armed forces. It's also, a lot of taxpayers' money at stake. And we know only too well sagas like the Watchkeeper drone, which was an observation type of uncrewed aircraft acquired by the army several years ago, which they took the decision in the autumn to take out of service because it was perceived to be too big and vulnerable and slow over the battlefield. But I think something like 1.2 billion was spent on that, really for very little good. So yeah, it's a big challenge. You want to spend the money on the right things. There's some good pointers in the paper, but is it a panacea? I doubt it.
No, I think I'm inclined to agree. It would be unnecessarily partisan to not acknowledge that it is fundamentally a good review in terms of what it is identifying as the problem and the solutions it recommends to solve. I'm not sure that the spending envelope the MOD has been given remotely matches the ambition. And the problem with that is that invariably you therefore have to delete incumbent capabilities in order to create the financial headroom to invest in the new stuff. And to be sympathetic to John Healey and his ministerial team for the decisions that they now face, such is the pace of MOD procurement that invariably you end up making those deletions. I speak from bitter experience, with absolutely no prospect of the new capabilities arriving before the end of the Parliament. So, to a reactionary party like Reform, that is manna from heaven, because you end up with, they've cut the Navy, they've cut the Army, they've cut the Air Force, and what have we got to show for it? So I fear that for all of the brilliant work that's gone into it, and the correct analysis that they've made, they won't have the money or the processes to move fast enough to achieve the transformation in a politically relevant time frame. Now, you would rightly say, I think, that the politically relevant time frame is less important than the enemy relevant time frame, but both kind of matter in terms of defence policy. If the UK is going to be serious about bringing these new technologies into the force, is there a danger that we've got too much on the programme of record that is the big industrial age, slow-moving, single points of failure like tanks, ships, planes, submarines?
The tank procurement, this is the Challenger 3, is essentially done, isn't it? I mean, the money's largely been spent. Production is in full swing, or it's creating new turrets for existing Challenger hulls. So, for good or bad, that one's effectively done. I think.
But to your watchkeeper point, that is,
yes,
the danger is that just because it is, a program that is almost completely now funded but not yet delivered, you could still be in the process of fundamentally procuring the wrong thing.
Yeah. I have to say, I don't think it's great for the modern battlefield that we've seen the types of things and weapons we've seen being used against armor in Ukraine, for example. But yeah, let's park that for a moment, because in relative terms, I mean, the management consultants will always go to the biggest line items in the budget first, and so you've got to think about things like the replacement of Trident, which is hugely expensive, and the refurbishment of the plants where they build the nuclear weapons at Aldermaston, and then you get to these big things like the new fighter aircraft called Tempest in the UK, which is a collaborative project, but it would seem that around 14 billion have already been allocated to that, and it could end up costing quite a bit more. And other big ticket items that were talked about on the day that the review was released, like buying more nuclear powered submarines. Now, some of those, as you know very well, I mean, the Trident thing, well, you might question it from the point of view of technical risk. I think the general view would be that we've got no choice but to keep going with this. But then if you look at the political risk factor and people's sensitivity now to close strategic partnership with the US, is that relevant? I mean, you could argue on the one hand that Mr. Trump will only be president for less than 4 years now, whatever it is, 3.5. and that the timescale for delivery of this project is so much longer than that, that the world would be quite different anyway. So we shouldn't fixate too much on the kind of things that have been happening in recent months. I think some of these other things, though, are potentially problematic. Coming back to your previous question about the speed of technical advance. So the new fighter aircraft, undoubtedly the UK needs one. When the requirement was first formulated, there seemed to be a sort of open-mindedness about whether or not that would have a pilot in it, whether or not it would become a sort of drone bomber, or whether it would have a human being in there to make the critical decisions at that moment. And people tell me that the kind of autonomous version of this new fighter plane, Tempest we'll call it, is sort of falling away as an option now. And what they might do is create smaller aircraft that would fly along beside it, but without a pilot, and would act in concert with it. But I think the imponderables there, I mean, when you think about it, that, you know, they're hoping to get the thing flying and into some sort of basic operational state in about 15 years. Well, we can imagine that's probably quite optimistic. And then if you say, well, hang on a minute, but then let's look at the pace of developments in AI sensors, you know, which might be satellites, they might be electronic information gathering nodes, they might be all sorts of things, radars traditionally defined, but all these different things that might suddenly mean that within a matter of a few years, an aircraft flying in the sky could be very, very rapidly detected, and weapons with the capability to take it down very quickly vectored onto it. So, you know, there's a dizzying pace of change around those technologies. And as you say, you know, these are the programs of record. And I think we also know from past experience, you know, the long story of the kind of post-1945 MOD and the way it buys weapons and all the rest of it, that what often happens is the kind of identity of the armed services, either individually or collectively, becomes very bound up with a particular project. And I think one can imagine the people with a sort of fighter pilot background, you know, coming to a view that Tempest is absolutely indispensable for the UK. Obviously, industrially, there are all sorts of benefits of keeping going in that sector, high-tech sector, but also for the RAF and its sort of professional culture. And you see similar things in the Army and Navy as well. So yes, I think that's very problematic, particularly when, you know, coming back to this point about this constant churn now of technological change, you know, and a feeling that putting more and more either AI or AI developed algorithms. So for example, the targeting software in some of the new drones that are being supplied to the Ukraine is developed with AI, and it basically sifts through images of all known Russian equipment, for example, in that case, to allow the drone to recognize it visually during the last mile or two of its flight, so that if Russian jamming prevents an operator from guiding the weapon into the target, it will autonomously do so. It'll do so on its own. But then just this week we hear that a similar kind of uploaded AI algorithm for dogfighting between fighter planes has been tested over the Baltic by the Swedes, with, you know, one fighter plane with a person in it and the other one effectively, well, they both were crewed, but driven by this algorithm, and showing it to be quite effective. Now, if you imagine that type of approach several years down the line, you know, does that leave us still wanting a fighter plane with a person in it? You know, okay, if we take the person out of it and turn it into a, you know, it's quite a big plane, this planned aircraft, and it could cross the Atlantic and launch all sorts of missiles. So it's got a long range, lots of fuel. Does buying the same sort of thing without a pilot actually save you much money? You know, if the whole thing is then AI and sensor and all the rest of it driven. So those are really big questions. And in terms of the public purse and how these billions are spent, I don't envy the people trying to answer them.
I'm already wishing that we were in the process of making a series of programs, Mark, because there's tons to expand on. But just to pick two things. Um, so, firstly, on the sort of crewing of platforms, I used to beat up the Air Force on the basis that if you looked at a destroyer in the First World War in the Navy, a destroyer in the Second World War, a destroyer in the Gulf War, and a destroyer now, you can see a reduction in the crew from sort of 700 or 800 down to just over 200
Mm.
today. If you looked at a tank at the Battle of Cambrai in the First World War, there was a crew of 6 or 7 down to a crew of 3 or 4
8.
today. If you look at the first ever fighter jet to the latest, it's 1 1 1 1 1 1 1. Now, I would use that as an example of why the Air Force was failing to innovate. They would say that they've always been at the irreducible minimum. But I think what's very interesting is such is the sophistication of the electronic warfare battle now that we're seeing all of these uncrewed systems are no longer truly autonomous. They're flying with these fiber optic spools so that they become wire guided. And so I've heard people speak really compellingly now about how if EW is going to be so all pervasive, you can't just have the human in the loop 5,000 miles to the rear because the human will be cut out of the loop by EW. So your solution is one of two things: either a completely autonomous AI driven fighting force that is prosecuting the enemy entirely on its own decision making with no human in the loop, or you still need to get a human forward, be that on a command ship or a command jet or the one tank in the battle space with the hundreds of drones all operating around it. But that's how you maintain an element of human decision making in the modern battle space. I wonder where you stand on that, because I think the guiding light for now, discuss whether it changes in the second week of the war when the war comes. But Western governments are very much of the view that a human must always remain in the loop somehow, and that kill decisions remain in humankind's hands rather than the hands of an algorithm.
Yeah, and I think that makes eminent sense, doesn't it? If you imagine that situation, which does occur from time to time, of an airliner coming towards London that doesn't respond to air traffic control and all the different squawks and signals that are being sent towards it, and a fighter jet is sent up to have a look and see if it's been hijacked, or, are we looking at a 9/11 situation? I think all of us, if we were on that plane, would prefer a human to be in the cockpit of that fighter jet, particularly because we know that, some types of AI that are being used now, like the large language models, which is different, obviously, to an autonomous aircraft, but we know that they're developing these increasingly large rates of hallucinations, so-called, basically making things up, and that the developers can't quite explain why it is that this is happening. Now, some are suggesting that they are simply learning to ape human behavior, which is, sometimes a talent for BS, as it were, and therefore they're trying to sort of blag their way through certain situations, literally AI giving cheeky answers to people saying, are you making things up, and all that sort of thing. Now, coming back to autonomy in weaponry, I think you're right. I mean, the point you're making about electronic warfare is absolutely right. So then you end up with literally a wire. People used to make jokes about electric cars and would the flex be long enough to keep it plugged in? Well, some of these drones being used on the front line have spools 20, 25 kilometers long of fiber optics that deploy as they fly. But this is all to do with the issue of jamming. And ultimately, I think autonomy is a more efficient answer to that. It's one thing with a
But
weapon.
inherent to that is the complete removal of the human from the kill loop.
Well, not to no. Well, the fiber optic is, of course, a way of a person remaining in control. But yes, of course, inherent to just turning it over to completely autonomous operation. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And personally, I would be I would take exactly the same view as you. And, and I mentioned the sort of 9/11 sort of scenario. But once again, for those people who don't find the idea of us going to war against Russia particularly credible, and we think more about things that have actually happened in the recent past, those sorts of operation where special forces might be entering a house where hostages are, or where there's a mixture of innocents and terrorists, once again, you think, well, I'm going to put my money on the judgment of that SAS operator as they go through the door, rather than on some robotic device that goes in, with heat sensors and other things, seeking out people in order to eliminate them. So yes, I think we're certainly still at a stage, and even if you get to a point where you have these drone swarms and fleets of, they call them uncrewed ground vehicles, UGVs, but effectively they are tanks or other armored vehicles without crews, moving across the battlefield. I mean, you get down to the really prosaic stuff of, who's going to change the batteries, and who's going to make the necessary adjustments of battle damage and all the rest of it when they come back from a mission. Human beings are definitely going to be there on the battlefield, I would say, for the foreseeable future, even if their role is, for example, once these swarms of drones have come in and swept some ridge clear or something like that in the Ukrainian context, that the humans will have to go forward in order to hold that and establish it as a new forward base for these robotic or uncrewed systems. So people will still be moving about on the battlefield. They'll still be part of it, which means that many of the things that we recognize as part of the armory of a modern state, whether that's a heavily armored vehicle or whether it's a helicopter carrying soldiers forward, they'll all still be part of the picture, I think, for some years to come. You can't turn the whole thing over to robotics because, I mean, once they get sufficiently developed technically in a robotic sense and smart enough in an AI sense to plug themselves in, repair their own damage and all the rest of it, then you really are beginning to look towards potentially existential threats from a human perspective.
Quite. Mark, the other thing I wanted to pick up on your excellent essay on the sort of changing nature of military inventories was you spoke about the renewal of the UK nuclear deterrent. Now, for those who are watching this who don't necessarily understand how that works, the UK operates a sovereign nuclear deterrent in so much as it is entirely the business of the United Kingdom government how it chooses to deploy nuclear weapons. But the UK nuclear enterprise is very closely intertwined with the US. We use the Trident missile delivery system, which is a US system, and there's lots of other technology sharing around propulsion, for example. Now, that propulsion exchange of technology was broadened to include the Australians only 3 or 4 years ago to great fanfare. And there's lots of alarm within UK and Australian military circles this week because Bridge Colby, who most people credit as being the brains in the US DoD, has said that he is not convinced that Aukus, that propulsion exchange, is any longer in the US interest. Mark, what's your take on that? Is this saber rattling, or are we about to see Aukus unravel?
Well, part of the deal, as you know very well, but just so that people listening in understand, is that as Australia builds up towards deploying new submarines in the 2040s, that it puts people on board UK and US submarines to train them in the necessary skills, but then acquires its own small fleet of nuclear-powered submarines in the not too distant future. I think dates have been given like the early 2030s. Now, the idea of this, when this agreement was made, was that the Americans would pass on between 3 and 5 nuclear submarines so that wholly Australian crews or Australian mentored crews could start working on these and really get all the skills and training up to scratch, and of course the operational savvy of how to use these boats. Now, the problem I think for the US is if you look at their attack submarine, nuclear powered submarine fleet, they require a build rate of around 2 a year. And in order to maintain that with the number of slipways and yards they've got that can build nuclear submarines, they can't really take more than 5 years to build each submarine. And they're currently taking 6 years. So there's a bit of a looming crisis for the US in terms of how it maintains its own nuclear submarine fleet and the sort of numbers that it's got at the moment of around 60, I think it is. So I can well imagine that if I was the chief of naval operations sitting in the Pentagon running the US Navy, I would be rather nervous about a commitment to lend Australia 3 new submarines at a point in the not too distant future. And that's why Bridge Colby is reassessing this whole thing. And I think that given the, America first nature of the Trump administration and its whole political philosophy, I think you're right to be worried, and people who are worried are right to be worried, that if it looks like a significant impact on the US submarine fleet, they may well seek to get out of this commitment, particularly this element of it, which is offering them to the Australians in a few years' time. And that's, I think, where the real nub of this comes. Now, apparently, some people have been commenting this morning that this, we see things as being quite difficult, for example, with the F-35 for contractual reasons, all the supply chain and other reasons. And apparently, you've got the added complexity here that this is governed by a treaty between the nations concerned. So it's not just a contractual commitment, but it's a treaty commitment that the UK, US, and Australia have entered into to do this together. Now, I guess the treaty could become a dead letter if effectively the US stops cooperating, but it does mean they're obliged by the treaty to sort of carry on in good faith. So I think we could find it could be quite hard for the Americans to just from one day to the next say, well, we're not going to do this. And I suspect that what they'll be scratching their heads over in the Pentagon is whether there are alternative ways of trying to reach the same objective. Because I think all of them get it, that having several more nuclear-powered submarines available with all the capabilities they've got of remaining underwater for months, high turns of speed compared with the diesel-electric ones, all of those other things, would be a very good thing to have the extra ones that the Royal Australian Navy would operate in terms of the strategic balance with China. And that in that sense, the objective is still one that I suspect the US Navy and clearly the UK would very much support. The question is, how do you achieve it when the difficulties of increasing production of nuclear submarines are such that it may be profoundly problematic to do it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good analysis, Mark. I hope that the longer term view prevails, because you're absolutely right. There's a thing about yard capacity, which I don't think is a yard productivity issue. I just think these platforms take a long time to build and to commission. But the short term pain of Australia operating 3 Virginias in the Pacific theatre fully alongside the Indo-PACOM, so they're not lost to the American effort in the Pacific. But what that does is lays the foundations for 12 Australian submarines. I think they've committed to buy, or 8, I can't remember exactly which, that they will then be operating also in that theatre. So there's a sort of short-term gain of the loss of 3 Virginias to the US Navy, but that lays the foundations for the Aussies having a nuclear-powered attack submarine force that is entirely alongside the US Navy in the Pacific from the 2040s onwards. So I hope that longer term view prevails rather than the short term issue over the number of holes that are physically arriving in the USN and whether that's enough. Mark, I'm conscious of time ticking on, and there's a question that needs to be asked given the rumours that are swirling. We time-stamped this episode for a reason, because noises over what Trump might do in Iran are becoming ever more urgent. Are we on the edge of seeing Trump take some sort of kinetic action against the Iranians?
Well, we're certainly at a moment, I think, where the desire in the White House to have Iran believe that they are in earnest about the threat of force is definitely defining this moment. But the other thing is, there does seem to have been a shift recently in the kind of assessment, the view of what's going on in Iran, and that's the other factor here. So just as America is trying to appear credible in its threats of a military operation against Iranian nuclear facilities, so the Iranians may be trying to show their breakout options and their options of pushing on to create a nuclear weapon, or indeed may actually have started that process which America is sworn to prevent, as is Israel. So I think the key things that we've learned is, the first was that there was some testimony from the US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, which seemed to change the language around whether Iran was going now for a nuclear weapon. And really, the view has been constant since 2003, when they abandoned a nuclear weapon project, that Iran hasn't done that they've been happy to sort of produce the necessary materials, the fissile materials, but not to actually actively engage in trying to make those into a weapon. So superficially, it would seem that the American assessment of that question may have changed. The other thing we know for sure, because it was published yesterday in Vienna, which is the seat of the UN nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Authority, which of course is a more neutral body, is that they have definitely changed their language and said now that for the first time in 20 years, Iran is in breach of its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which in layman's terms broadly means that the IAEA, this international organization that goes in to monitor things, have uncovered evidence of some sites that may have been used before as part of this previous nuclear weapons development program, but are also concerned about the possibility that nuclear materials and sites are being concealed from them. So, now the opinions of the IAEA are not going to trouble a man of Donald Trump's predispositions too much, such as his contempt for international organizations, the UN and all the rest of it. I mean, back in the day of a sort of Biden presidency or George W. Bush, I think this change in assessment by the nuclear watchdog would have been quite important in terms of changing the diplomatic temperature. All of this is happening as we await a possible new round of talks between the US and Iranian negotiators, which is supposed to happen on Sunday. So it may be that all these things are coming together, and it's a sort of maximum pressure moment in which the Americans are doing various things like shutting down embassy operations in Baghdad, in Iraq, telling people in other parts of the Middle East, to hunker down, basically, avoid certain places. All of these other things which are suggestive that military action might be imminent. That America might be using all of those as a way of just really piling on the pressure before this next round of talks. But of course, there are some wild cards here, which is to what extent can Trump influence Benjamin Netanyahu, if he is in possession of the same intelligence, if indeed it's come from the Israelis, about the Iranians going for a nuclear weapon, about what the IAEA has discovered, then, Israel might decide to mount its own military operation, which would put the Americans in a very tricky position. Trump has said effectively that he's tried to dissuade the Israelis from doing that. But it is a very tense moment, and whether or not America would join in the first wave of strikes like that, it's very hard to see them staying out because, Iran has promised to retaliate with big missile bombardments against Gulf states as well as against Israel. And America has made clear it would defend the Gulf states. So it's very hard to see how, if military action starts, it doesn't quickly draw in America.
Two quick questions then. Firstly, Trump obviously got on well with MBS throughout his first administration, and the visit the other week shows that the relationship remains very friendly. Should we assume that MBS has given his support to the US taking military action if that is what Trump deems necessary?
I'm not sure we can assume that. This is the Saudi Crown Prince for people who don't know the MBS acronym. I'm not sure we can assume that because Iran and Saudi Arabia have had a little sort of diplomatic rapprochement in recent months or the last year or two, which has aimed to take some of the heat and the sort of competitive nastiness out of their rivalry in the Gulf region. And I'm not sure that the Saudis would give the Americans, or let alone the Israelis, the thumbs up for an operation like this, because they know there's every possibility that Iran in its responses might target Saudi Arabia. So it's very hard to know. I mean, I think the Saudis probably reckon or understand that they could get dragged into it. But at the same time, we don't know what their sort of confidential advice is to Trump. I mean, look, Trump has been pretty clear about it, that he wants to do a deal. And a lot of people have even said, well, it'll be a deal on inferior terms to the one he pulled America out of, a decade ago. But I think we've still got a few days to run, unless Israel takes some kind of unilateral action, before we see whether all of this is really just piling on the pressure before another round of talks in a bid to clinch a deal, or whether it is the preamble to a military action.
And then very finally, Iran has a very close relationship with the Russians particularly, but the Chinese are an important actor in this too. Any danger that action in Iran ends up with Russia and China rowing into support somehow?
Well, I think with regard to Russia, a lot of people think that Trump has been unnecessarily sort of supine towards Putin. But one thing he does seem to have got from Putin is a couple of declarations that Iran should not be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. So I think Russia would probably stay on the sidelines if America was to act in this regard, to act militarily. Certainly in the negotiating rounds and things like that we're still in the world of negotiation rather than military action, Russia has tried to be supportive and offer ways to help Iran, secure its uranium and all this kind of thing. China, I think, will therefore probably, and we are in a new world now, but would therefore probably also stay on the sidelines, particularly if it was a sort of brief military exchange and didn't become a sort of permanent factor that might, for example, disrupt the shipment of oil out of the Gulf. So I think for the moment, those two are not keen to really back up Iran in any sort of muscular way. I think they will offer rhetorical and diplomatic support to Iran. But if things were to go badly wrong and bombs be dropped and all the rest of it by the US, I think the signs are that the Russians and the Chinese would probably not want to get involved.
Mark, fascinating. We are watching interesting times, and thank heavens for the cool-headed analysis that you bring to the pages of Sunday Times every week. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, and to the Crisis Room podcast.
Exactly. Subscribe to the Crisis Room podcast, but not before you subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel for more of Times Radio's brilliant geopolitical content. For now, thank you for watching Superpowers. Goodbye.